Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for listening. My name's Daniel Finkelstein. Very nice to be doing this for an organisation with which Hal James is associated. Hal was a very good colleague of mine when we both worked for John Major. He gave me one of my favourite pieces of advice when I asked him what on earth I should do about my diary, which was so full. He replied, well, don't accept any invitation in which you wouldn't be prepared to do the next day. And however long in advance it is, remember, would you wish to do this if it was tomorrow? Well, that is the best piece of advice probably that I've ever received on anything, and Hal was responsible for it. Because I haven't got long, let me go straight to it. I want to look at some of the political conditions that we are now in, and I want to start by advising you to watch the film Jaws. There is, as you probably know, a lot of stuff in Jaws about the mayor and whether or not the mayor should open and close the beach. And the mayor wants to open the beach, but he knows that it will be dangerous, but nevertheless he doesn't want to end the tourism. This was actually a real incident. It's been turned into fiction by the makers of Jaws, but it was a real incident. And because it was a real incident, we know what the political effects are. Some political scientists have done some work on what happened in the election following the New Jersey beach shark disaster. And it turns out that the president, Woodrow Wilson, who had nothing whatsoever to do, he was from New Jersey, but had nothing to do with the administration of the beaches or any of the local government. He was completely blameless in it, but at the next election he did much worse in places which had shark attacks than in places which did not. This is a very anomalous result until you appreciate that people are not really following politics very closely, that they don't necessarily know what action was taken by government that did or did not have an impact on a particular situation, that they don't follow epidemiology, that they don't know whether the app should be decentralized or centralized or what its effect might be on battery power. Their interest is in how them or their families are doing and what the impact is on them. And they will punish or reward the incumbent depending on how they feel at the next general election. The biggest problem for Donald Trump, because he's got an election so soon, is that he was relying on good feeling about the economy to get himself re-elected, and now he's got this bad feeling, not just of the economy, but a feeling of danger and also people's feelings that they are at home. Whatever the government does, whether it's judged to do well or judged not to do well, in this country or in another country, it faces a significant political problem that people don't feel as good as they used to, and that they won't probably for quite some time. So the first political effect, what I call the shark effect, is really just as flat as that. No government wants to have a situation where its citizens are poorer and they have to stay inside. And all discussions about whether or not people will judge the government to do well or badly are really secondary to that. The second thing as you should do, as well as watch Jaws, is study colonoscopies. That may seem an odd bit of advice, but you would imagine, wouldn't you, that the pain caused by an operation such as a colonoscopy would be the amount of pain that you experience at any given time multiplied by the length of time it takes. But that isn't actually what you end up feeling. What really influences you is what happens at the peak and what happens at the end. They discovered that you could make a colonoscopy go on longer, but it could be remembered as less painful if at the end of it began to go down quite slowly. This is the reason why governments depend not just on how well off people are in general, but how well off they are when an election is held, because people's memories of how they felt at particular times in the past and who was in office at that time are not that strong. They can last for a while. The major government which I worked for did, after all, experience that between 1992 and 1997. But it's how people feel at the general election that really matters, and we are a long way off that. I should say we're also a long way off another thing. We are a long way off the end of this particular virus crisis. There is a sort of feeling, I think, that because we've passed the peak of the virus, somehow the virus is less dangerous, but sadly that isn't the case. The moment you begin to release lockdown, there's no reason why, as lockdown reduces, you won't get an increase in virus spread. If you don't do it very carefully, the R will soon go above 1, the famous R, and soon it will be spreading again. You'll have to lock down again until you get a vaccine. And after all, we still haven't got a vaccine for AIDS. We still haven't got a vaccine for a cold. It may be that we don't get a vaccine, or that it takes a very long time to have a vaccine. Until you do that, the virus keeps spreading every time you let people engage in social life. And that means we're not at the end of this, we're only at the beginning. One of my objections to comparing this government's performance with other countries is that it simply assumes not so much that we're all counting the same way, but that we're near the end, and that we can make reasonable comparisons at this point. And I'm afraid that is itself quite a complacent view. We're not near the end. It could last a very, very long time. And because it could last a very long time, its political effects are quite uncertain, because we don't know how long it will be before a general election that we begin to return to a normal life. In a sense, general election considerations are secondary for everybody. What people are concerned about at the moment is how well we do in terms of living our life and in terms of doing it healthily. But without any question, if you're looking at the political effects, which is what I was asked to talk about, you can see that it will take quite a long time for the virus to come under control, quite a long time for us to return to anything approaching normality. The hit to our economy will therefore be very large, and will be a lot closer to the general election before we start to recover. So the political effects are difficult to calculate, but it's not just the shock effect that potentially makes it profound, but also this sense that we're not really even at the end of the beginning, in that famous Churchill phrase. The third thing we should do when considering the political effects is follow the money. That famous phrase that Deep Throat is supposed to have said to Woodward in the parking garage during the Watergate scandal. In reality, that phrase was actually invented by the brilliant William Goldman, who also wrote Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and was never said by Deep Throat, but it's pretty good as a way of understanding politics. Most politics at root is economic. So we think that politics would be, for example, cultural. We discussed the issue of political correctness, gone mad, and think that's a cultural idea. Well, actually, it isn't. Even that isn't a cultural idea. That's all about how well-off, educated people have an advantage in a market, but worry about discrimination. And so that being the one thing that could hold them back becomes a centerpiece of the politics of people with a lot of social capital. And those people who find that political correctness is the one thing that could undermine their incomes, people who are less well educated, who think discrimination actually favours them, those people tend to think political correctness has gone mad. Most political questions, which seem to be, on their surface of it, simply cultural, are actually economic. The truth is, over the next 4 years, 5 years, we're not going to have very much money. I think the extent to which that is true hasn't really sunk in yet. It's not so much the big amount of money that we've had to spend during this period. My judgment is the Chancellor will decide to suck that up as a debt, providing that he can keep the deficit to GDP ratio roughly stable. The problem will be going forward if we don't get a V-shaped recovery, and I'm a bit sceptical about that. I think it'll take quite a long time, and there'll be parts of the economy which are debt-ridden, or they've just simply taken a hit to their forms of organisation. It will take a longer time to come back. That means we'll have less money to spend just at the moment when we think we should spend more money on our public services. We should be giving more money to people who've been in the front line in the health service, for example, and increased nurses' salaries. We also definitely have to do something about social care at the centre of this crisis. How are we going to afford to pay that? It seems to me inevitable that we'll have to increase taxes to pay that, probably that we'll have to constrain public spending. This will be very controversial and politically difficult. Rishi Sunak is as well as everyone else at the beginning, and he's at the giving out money stage, he'll find that next stage more difficult. Let me finally finish with one other political principle, the contrast principle. If you put one hand in a bucket of cold water, put one hand in a bucket of warm water, take both hands out and put them in a bucket of lukewarm water, the hand that was in the cold water will feel hot, the hand that was in the hot water will feel cold. That is the contrast principle. And the contrast principle in British politics at the last two elections, last three elections really. The last two has been Jeremy Corbyn. The previous election to that, Ed Miliband. This contrast with the Conservative leader always broke in favour of the Conservatives. Will that still be the case? My view is that though people haven't glommed on yet to Keir Starmer, it may well not be the case. I think that Keir Starmer will prove to people a potential Prime Minister. Labour still has very deep problems, which we can talk about another time in terms of its constituency areas, but I don't think it'll have the same problem that it had at the last election, which is that people simply don't want its leader to be Prime Minister. So for all those four reasons, for the Jaws reason, for the colonoscopy reason, for the contrast principle reason, for the follow the money reason, we are in a changing period of politics, and I think it's harder than it was when we went in to work out what it'll be like when we come out. Thank you for listening.